So maybe our first question before we get into Sentinel-1 and CrowdStrike, the key differences between both of those. I just wanted to maybe just start with like a brief foundational question. And just for our audience, do you guys want to just give us a very brief overview of the security landscape? Like, you guys have done a lot of work on the whole cybersecurity space. If you guys could just give us a very high level overview of the key sectors
Yeah,
and industries, and then we
sure.
would use those to go into our conversation on CrowdStrike and Sentinel-1.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think right now the outlook for the industry, for the cybersecurity industry, is fantastic. It really is. I mean, cybercrime is becoming more prolific, and it's rising in sophistication. You've got highly skilled bad actors that are implanting malware into the IT systems of organizations, and often this malware is fileless, which means it's not detected by typical legacy antivirus software solutions. And this malware can live off the land for many months, remain undetected, like was the case with the SolarWinds data breach that was unveiled in December 2020. And the malware will be, looking to exfiltrate data or look to find valuable data and encrypt it and then launch a ransomware. And these type of attacks were pretty much confined to a very small percentage of the enterprise world a few years ago. Perhaps the most prestigious enterprises and institutions that these hackers wanted to target. Um, and also bear in mind that the percentage of cyber criminals that can pull off such an attack where the malware is undetected and lives off the land is, it's a very small percentage. It requires a very high amount of skill. So, yeah, as I say, a few years ago, this was confined to a very small percentage of the corporate world, but now these highly skilled actors are sponsored by nation states. So they have access to technology. They can use automation. They can use AI. They can use machine learning. So they can increase the frequency in which they are producing new variants of malware, and also they have the scale. They have a greater scale, and they can make sure that they do more damage and reach a bigger proportion of the corporate world. Um, and also, we're seeing trends on the dark web where we've got cybercrime as a service, where these highly skilled actors are renting out their knowledge and their techniques to more amateur actors. So they can make a means, so they have a means of earning a living as a cyber criminal. And then we also have things like specialization, where you get some cyber criminals who specialize in developing the malware, and other cyber criminals will specialize in distributing the malware. So you kind of got this, um, like what the dynamics that made SaaS very popular and successful, the as a service framework, the specialization across the software stack. We're seeing that now in cybercrime. So all these factors are just making it so, whereas a few years ago, these highly skilled actors could only target a very small percentage of the corporate world, these dynamics are making it so they have a much bigger reach. So we're going to start seeing these most highly sophisticated attacks um, filter down into the broader corporate world a lot quicker than we have in the past. And this is all in the context of cloud migration, cloud expansion, where organizations, as we all know, are transferring their IT infrastructure to multi cloud, hybrid environments, to edge deployments, Internet of Things, etc., etc. And it's just expanding the attack surface exponentially, and it's only going to continue because we're still very early on in the cloud journey. So clearly, there's a huge demand for cybersecurity, and also there's a huge demand for cybersecurity professionals. However, the supply of cybersecurity professionals hasn't risen commensurately. It's remained stagnant over the last few years, and this can you can trace this back to like structural issues in the education system, whereby there's just not enough young people becoming interested in cybersecurity and software in general. So you've got this huge skills shortage, this huge gap, and it's a very precarious situation for enterprises. And but how is this void going to be filled? Well, you need highly autonomous software. You need software that is driven by AI and machine learning, that is highly effective. Software that is multi-layered, and companies that are going to benefit from this precarious situation is the likes of Sentinel One, Palo Alto Networks, and Fortinet, and there's a few other best of breed security vendors. But yeah, it's kind of a precarious moment. It's a precarious time for enterprises, but it's a great time for security vendors. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
Simon,
yeah,
yeah. Sorry.
just adding 2 points to Jordan's note. So I think there are two major trends that are happening in the cybersecurity space. So the first one is we are kind of seeing the movement from the pure security solution into kind of adding the productivity gain kind of the solution, and we are also seeing the cybersecurity space overall is in a rapid shift, and we are going to see more and more platform that is consolidating multiple point solutions altogether. So on the spending pattern change, it's pretty interesting because from what we are seeing, cybersecurity has consistently been underinvested. So many IT managers, they treat cybersecurity as a kind of a regulatory mandate. And that is also the way how we usually calculate the TAM, the total addressable market, in one area. For example, if you think about the cloud security, the most typical way to calculate the TAM is you think about the cloud spending, the cloud infrastructure spending, say is 200 billion, and it will take 1%, and that's the TAM. But what we are seeing now is that cybersecurity vendors are not only blocking things, they are also enabling the productivity gain. So taking Fortinet, for example, previously they are just the firewall vendor, meaning they build a box that helps you block other content and traffic. But now what we are seeing is that they are adding the SD-WAN function to the hardware. So now they are not only blocking things, they are helping IT managers build things faster and manage their operations easier. So that's a big trend. And another trend is the platform. So previously, there is a kind of argument that in the cybersecurity space, you need best of the breed product, because if your product is not the best of the breed, there is always a point whereby you can be compromised. So it makes the cybersecurity space highly fragmented. You have the firewall vendor doing the best of the breed. You have the cloud security doing the best of the breed. And what we are now seeing is that there are multiple companies trying to build up a platform, allowing people to go into the platform and buy the modules that are best of the breed. So one great example is the Palo Alto Network. They have bought tons of good startups and combine them together to build up the platform. So I would say these are the two major trends in the cybersecurity space.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, CISOs, so Chief Information Security Officers, one of their biggest demands or desires that they've expressed in various surveys, one of them from Gartner, is consolidation. They want vendor consolidation because there's just so many point solutions that are proliferated, mainly because of the shortage in security professionals that we just mentioned earlier. So because of a shortage in security professionals, typically you get network administrators that fill the security function, the security role within an organization, but they're not typically qualified from a security perspective, but they know enough and they manage to get by. And because of this, they will kind of just think, oh, right, I need to fill this gap in our security posture. Oh, we'll get this vendor's point solution. And this occurs to the point where enterprises can have like anything up to from 50 to 100 different security solutions that are all kind of disjointed. So that's one reason why CISOs want vendor consolidation. But at the same time, as Simon says, CISOs also want the best of breed solutions at the same time. So they kind of want to have their cake and eat it. And with Palo Alto Networks, they can really have their cake and eat it because Palo Alto Networks has the broadest cybersecurity platform there is, and within all the aspects of that platform, they have best of breed solutions. You know, best of breed XDR solutions, best of breed zero trust, best of breed next generation firewall, best of breed SD-WAN. So yeah, it's in Palo Alto. I know we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves a bit with talking about Palo Alto Networks, but yeah, they are a great company to capitalize on these trends that we've just mentioned.
Great. That's awesome. Great. Thanks for that. Thanks for the overview. And for sure, I think the second segment of this Twitter Spaces would be really focused on Fortinet and Palo Alto networks, and really comparing them to the Zscalers of the world and the Cloudflare of the world, especially when we're looking at the security access services and the SASE and zero trust ecosystem. But no, that's great. So let's go directly into Sentinel-1 and CrowdStrike, the differences. And I think that's what we want to focus on, quite frankly, because from my experience and obviously being on FinTwit and everything, everyone knows about CrowdStrike. I mean, it's been a successful investment for almost everyone who's in the tech ecosystem ever since that IPO in 2019. And so I think everyone does has a good knowledge and an understanding of CrowdStrike. However, with Sentinel-1, quite a recent new IPO that just came into the market quite recently, and I think a lot of people are still trying to wrap their heads around I think it's more about the differences because on a very high level, everyone has the assumptions that they're exactly the same. They're pretty much the same. CrowdStrike is almost like an older brother, and Sentinel-1's like the younger brother or whatever. But in my research, quite recently, actually, been doing some research, and actually prior to the earnings call, there's been some notable differences. And you guys, from a lot of the work that I've seen on the internet, like you guys have really dug deep into Sentinel-1, and you've really tried to pick out the differences between both companies. And I think it's
Yeah.
not as similar as most people do think. So yeah, we're gonna break it apart. So maybe let's start with the broad overview. So you guys just give us a really
Yeah.
broad
Okay.
overview of CrowdStrike
Well,
and
well, yeah. Okay, bro. Well, it might be helpful to just have a very brief history of antivirus, just to explain what the angle CrowdStrike has come in with, and also the angle that Sentinel-1 has gone with. So, like, antivirus software began like in the 1990s, and it was a signature based antivirus software. So you've got a database on the endpoint, and it will collate signatures from all files that have been associated with viruses and malware previously. So whenever a new file comes inbound into the endpoint, the software will check the signature of that file, because every file has a signature, like a specific hash, and they'll check that signature, that hash, against the database to check if it might be connected to any previous virus. So this was successful, fairly successful through the 90s, but some gaps started to appear. But they kind of made it work. Vendors kind of made it work, combined it with some firewall functionality as well. But then in 2007, the data explosion, in large part thanks to the iPhone being introduced, the signature-based antivirus solutions just were no longer viable. With providing way less than 100% protection pretty much all the time, because there's just a crazy proliferation of new variants of viruses and new viruses, and the signature-based antivirus software needs to be updated all the time in order to function properly. So CrowdStrike comes in with a radically different view in 2011, I believe. They were founded, where instead of having kind of a heavy agent on the endpoint, they had a really light agent, which they call the sensor, and pretty much have all the brains of the antivirus operations in the cloud. So the sensor really doesn't it can do a bit of detection and remediation, but mainly it sends telemetry data back to up to the cloud, so the cloud analysts can do their analysis and collect it from all endpoints, and then they can remotely contain the threat. And then once investigation has occurred, they can they can eliminate the threat. So that was the EDR, the endpoint detection and response angle that CrowdStrike went in the early 2010s, and then other players came in, kind of focusing on the endpoint again, trying to put the brains on the endpoint, but without doing the signature-based antivirus, kind of using AI techniques, etc. And then Sentinel-1 come into the picture with what we think is striking an ideal blend of endpoint, say, having the brains on the endpoint and also having the brains in the cloud. So kind of a hybrid endpoint protection and EDR, endpoint detection and response, where they they have an agent on the endpoint which is still lightweight, but it's not as lightweight as CrowdStrike sensor, and it can detect, and also it can immediately contain and immediately eliminate, all without any human intervention. So Sentinel-1's endpoint component, it can detect and eliminate like 85% or 90% of all the threats, and kind of the more sophisticated threats might need some help from the cloud side of the operations. So yeah, that Simon will be able to add more to it, but generally that's the key difference. Is CrowdStrike is very lightweight on the endpoint, and very heavy in the cloud operations on the analysis side there. But Sentinel-1 is kind of almost like a hybrid, so it has the best their operations. There's a lot of brains on the endpoint, and the agent can do a lot, detect and eliminate a lot by itself without any human intervention, but also there's the cloud support as well. Simon, do you want to add to
Yeah,
that?
yeah. So adding to that, I think just a simple, keeping in a simple terms. So for the legacy antivirus companies that are based on the signatures, what they want to do is they want to create a huge database that includes all of the information they know about what a virus is, and then they will just check the files, and if it's in the database, they just kills the file. But with that, it's becoming more and more clumsy, because you need to keep updating the database and making things even worse. As Jordan said, you have infinite amount of mutation, so it's just impossible. So they just keep on adding new patches. So they added things like sandbox and endpoint network analysis. So they just keep introducing multiple software on top of the antivirus. So they inevitably they will slow the things down, and it's also making things even harder to manage. And then CrowdStrike and the Carbon Black, which is now acquired by VMware, they created this kind of notion called EDR. So instead of checking every file, they just have a pretty simple sensor and just observe um, how these files are working, and then see if there is any malicious behavior. And once it reach a certain threshold, they will just classify it as a kind of malicious file and then kill the file. But what the issue with that is that you don't do the immediate threat detection. You are just waiting to see how things are going on, and if they are going on the right on the wrong direction, you will step in and change the thing. So you kind of not going into the threat prevention immediately. You are doing the detection and the response. So that's the place where Sentinel-1 can kick in, because it has the EDR, but it also natively integrates the antivirus component within the endpoint. And they are not only based on the signature, but also use the machine learning and AI model on the endpoint's device. So you have this tight integration of EDR and the next generation antivirus together. So I think that's the um, breakthrough in terms of the cybersecurity for the endpoint.
Great, great. That's great. That's helpful. And just to kind of summarize what you guys have just said is primarily, and CrowdStrike came what 2011, whatever, when they got founded. By targeting the endpoint, they created this extremely lightweight solution on the endpoint for detecting threats and managing those. And obviously, they went extremely heavy on the cloud, primarily heavy, and that's
Yeah.
primarily CrowdStrike's main value proposition. However, Sentinel One came in kind of as that last mover advantage, or they came in and obviously they knew what CrowdStrike was up to, and created their platform to pretty much have a hybrid solution, right? Because I believe they're both on-prem as well as on the cloud, from what I know. And obviously, they've integrated EDR, but they natively integrate their antivirus with the existing endpoint, and that's the XDR, more advanced form on the platform. And so, and obviously, there's a lot more memory and storage of information on their own platform and Sentinel ones over CrowdStrike as well. So maybe let's first of all, I know we want to talk to different differences between both. We're going to talk about the product, the technology, and the go-to-market strategy. So from a product architecture perspective and the way Sentinel One builds their product, do you guys want to expand a little bit more on how their own architecture, they almost integrated all three forms of AI to create this one integrated XDR platform? Do you guys want to maybe touch a little bit on that architecture, or what Sentinel One did very differently that has almost made their own antivirus extremely like an highest solution? Maybe let's start with the architecture first.
Simon, do you want to take
Oh
that
yeah,
one?
yeah. Let me take it first. So I think um, uh, we all start with talking about the founder. So the CrowdStrike founder, um, he started his career in McAfee as a forensic analyst. So he kind of watched how antivirus landed on the endpoint and how it attacks the critical assets of the enterprises. So that's where he started his career. So I think it's rooted in CrowdStrike's gene. So they have this huge emphasis on the human expert in the beginning. So in the beginning of their EDR business is about gathering as much log data as they can, and then send it to the centralized cloud data lake. And then they have that human threat intelligence experts checking and correlating various activities all together. So I think that's where they got started. And with Sentinel-1, they started later, and they noticed that human experts and kind of using people to check everything is less efficient. So they went on with more automated way, use AI and machine learning. So AI and machine learning is kind of a hyped world, as you may see. So what's different, in my opinion, is that Sentinel-1 has better use of AI and machine learning that makes it more automated compared to CrowdStrike. And even CrowdStrike said that they have this kind of capability as well. But according to my analysis, they are still rooted in this human expert-centered threat intelligence. And another key difference in terms of their architecture, I think, is really about the native integration of EDR and the EPP. So EDR is like observing how things are going, and the EPP is the immediate prevention. So with CrowdStrike, they are doing the EDR first, and then they added the module, the NGAV, that's the prevention module later. So they don't have this kind of native integration. And I think ironically that's their marketing, because before Sentinel-1, CrowdStrike, their marketing is saying that the legacy antivirus companies, they just keep on adding so many different modules that makes the system too complex to manage. But now what we are seeing is that CrowdStrike also introduces EPP, that is the endpoint protection part, alongside with the EDR, while Sentinel-1, they have this native integration of EDR and EPP together as XDR in the beginning. So I think that's the major difference in terms of the architecture.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe clarify, and maybe you could as well. You could also pitch in Jordan here, as well as I'd actually like to get Muji's opinion at the end of this particular section, actually. But I want to go back to an early point that Simon mentioned about the use of how CrowdStrike emphasizes the use of human labor for kind of reading some aspects of the logging of data, logging of threat intelligence data, and how they make use of that. I mean, I'm sure CrowdStrike does use quite a bit of automation, just that you might need a little bit more assistance from your security operations team at any organization. So, do you guys want to maybe clarify that point a little bit more, just so people are kind of clear on that?
Yeah. So what I would say is that CrowdStrike has good automation, but compared to Sentinel-1, it seems to me that it's still on a different level compared to Sentinel-1. So Sentinel-1 has requires less human intervention, and their response time is way faster than CrowdStrike. So I think that's the major difference. And although, so it's kind of the marketing game, because it's pretty easy to say that we have AI, we have machine learning, but you need to see the test results. So as we will discuss, the meta attack test really gives us a good data point to see the response time from CrowdStrike and Sentinel-1. And what we are seeing
Yeah.
is that CrowdStrike's response time is way slower than Sentinel-1. So that's probably the root reason, because CrowdStrike, they still need kind of the human interaction, the human expert to interact with the machine, while
Yeah.
Sentinel-1, they are trying to make it easier to use and easier to operate.
Yeah. It might be to try and illuminate the differences, it might be worth touching on the MITRE ATT&CK evaluations that have been ongoing for the last couple of years. So MITRE ATT&CK are a not-for-profit cybersecurity organization based in the US, and they kind of serve as a knowledge base for the latest, most advanced, sophisticated attacks, often coming from hacker groups sponsored by nation states. And they collect all the details about these techniques that have been used by these hacker groups, and they will test participating security vendors' solutions. In the last couple of years, they've done 3 rounds of testing on antivirus solutions. So the Sentinel-1s participated, Palo Alto Networks, CrowdStrike, Trend Micro, several others. And pretty much across the board, Sentinel-1 came out on top, and Palo Alto Networks came a close second, and CrowdStrike came quite far down the rankings. Of there might have been about 15 vendors participating in these testings. So, and interestingly as well, not only did Sentinel-1 and Palo Alto Networks make considerably more detections and responses, and just provided better protection against these nation state sponsored hacker group attacks. They also made 0 configuration changes to their software, whereas CrowdStrike, I believe, on the 3rd round of testing, made 25 configuration changes. So that kind of just gives you an insight into Sentinel-1's out the box solution. It literally can just work off the shelf, out the box, and that is because it is very heavy. Its agent is very AI and machine learning driven, so it can do a lot without any human intervention. Whereas obviously CrowdStrike having to make 25 configuration changes, it's quite clear that there needs to be a lot of tweaks and human intervention involved before they're ready to proceed with the test. And it's interesting because right now the security community are pretty happy with CrowdStrike. I mean, when we published that article a few months ago, there was a lot of confusion because people would say, well, there's nobody's complaining about CrowdStrike. It's, everybody's happy with how the software performs, and that's because it's a massive step up from legacy antivirus software, absolutely. But mainly, these security professionals aren't yet encountering these highly sophisticated attacks that I kind of touched on earlier. But in due course, when these nation state sponsored attacks kind of filter down into the broader corporate world, which is in motion really because of these dynamics that we mentioned earlier, I think the difference between CrowdStrike and Sentinel-1 is going to be more apparent across kind of the more mainstream security community, and unless CrowdStrike starts to fundamentally change their software and add more brains to the endpoint, then the word legacy gets bandied about a lot, so I don't want to use that word, but they could lose their status as the number one antivirus solution provider. So we view Sentinel-1 right now is the technical lead. That's just our opinion. But in a few years, unless CrowdStrike makes some fundamental changes, Sentinel-1 could also be the market leader, potentially in a few years. So I think, does that kind of illuminate the differences at all, Francis? Or...
Right. It does help, and just so people know, MITRE is in cybersecurity. It's kind of the Gartner or the Forrester for cybersecurity. And actually, what Jordan actually mentioned earlier on is on MITRE, I believe they have this like coordinated hacker report. So it's almost like a planned report where like for example, if I was in an organization, for example, we could create a competition to see who hacks the organization system the best way. And so it's like you're having the best of the hackers who are coming against the system. And MITRE, which is MITRE, then ranks to see which of the security providers best responded to those detections or threats in terms of speed, in terms of time, in terms of effectiveness, in terms of visibility and threats. And just as
Yeah.
an FYI, for most of you who might be aware, you could go on. I've had my pinned tweet, which is on my homepage. You could go to the thread on Sentinel-1 and go to number 10 and 11 of that thread, and you would see some of those rankings. That you would see some of those rankings that Simon just talked about. But yeah, so that's good. It makes that does help. It does provide a bit of differences. But I think one thing we should make clear is obviously CrowdStrike still has a phenomenal product, as you guys mentioned, and the speed is still very good. But I think what we're maybe seeing here is in terms of MITRE's report, the speed at which Sentinel-1 detects those reports and actually responds is just a few more seconds, a lot more faster, and they capture a little bit more. Correct? I just want to make sure I'm
That,
correct.
that, that's absolutely correct. Yes, they had a high detection rate and faster response time. But kind of most importantly, I think it's they didn't make any configuration changes. They made no tweaks to the software whatsoever ready for the test. Same with Palo Alto Networks. CrowdStrike, however, needed to make 25 configuration changes before they was ready for the test. I believe that was for round 3 of the testing, and they also needed to make changes to the software for the previous 2 rounds as well. So that's highly significant, and that's why we believe Sentinel-1 not only is the technically the leader in terms of having the better, more effective product, but we also think they have a more scalable product.
Yeah,
Because
let's touch on that. So we've talked about automation, we've talked about speed of response, speed of detection, and we're setting on one. Let's talk about the scalability because this is a conversation we might talk about later in terms of the gross margins, differentials
yeah,
between both businesses, and because everyone talks about the fact that CrowdStrike has a significantly higher gross margin than
yeah,
um Sentinel-1. However, from some of the research that I've read and what you guys have even talked about at length is with the way Sentinel-1's product is architectured with a lot more automation and a less use of human intervention in threat responses, you guys do believe this business model should be a lot more scalable over time. So, do both of you maybe take turns going, just maybe give us the foundation as to how this business is extremely scalable and how you guys see Sentinel-1's platform becoming maybe even as high as the gross margins over time?
Yeah, so maybe
yeah,
I will
Simon,
take the question.
yeah,
So
yeah, sure.
in terms of the scalability, so I think there are 2 points. So first is you need to train your analysts, your cybersecurity employees to use the CrowdStrike and Sentinel products. So you need to make it easier to operate. And second is that in terms of scalability, you need to make the deployment easier as well. So that's the software installation, things like that. And regarding the training part, what I'm seeing is that to use the best potential of CrowdStrike, you need to train a SOC 2 analyst. So you need to train a security analyst for a lot longer hours compared to Sentinel-1. So I think that shows how Sentinel-1 is easier to use and less
Yeah,
time consuming and for organizations who want to use it.
yeah,
And in terms of the deployment, I think CrowdStrike it's pretty good. It's already a leap forward compared to the legacy and antivirus vendors. But I'm also seeing it kind of tricky because they still have like 7% revenue coming from the professional service side. And that's not usually what you would expect from a very scaled SaaS company, because it's a name, it's software as a service. You want to standardize as much as you can. And in the beginning, you may use professional service because you want to have closer configuration changes to specific clients. But as you scale, you should expect professional service to come down, because the software itself is able to act as a service instead of needing the labor, the human to jump in and do the professional service.
Yeah. I think the way indicators that SentinelOne as a more scalable solution is they can serve the smaller companies, the SMBs, and I know CrowdStrike can as well, but really I mean, you look at the SentinelOne on the website, for instance, they have pricing, yeah, and this is often indicative that it's a solution that um, you can just make a few clicks and get it installed and get on the way with it. You have very transparent pricing with Cloudflare, companies like Okta, Asana, these kind of cutting edge SaaS companies, they mainly have pricing, not all the time, and it's just indicative that of the fact that it's just very easy to get going with the product. It's easy to get it operational. So with that in mind, and we know that it can work out the box. Clearly deployments can be a lot smoother with SentinelOne and a lot faster. So in that regard, it looks like a more scalable solution, and we know that because like CrowdStrike mainly targets like the large enterprises, where SentinelOne had been until recently targeting the smaller companies, but now has made a big push up into the enterprise segment. And also, what I think is quite amazing with SentinelOne recently is their progress in the partner ecosystem. So there's a lot of incident response units and MSPs wanting to use SentinelOne software, because it makes their life so much easier, because it can detect like 85% of threats, and it just unburdens security analysts at an enterprise. It can unburden these incident response units and MSP workers as well. And that's quite a contrast with CrowdStrike, because as Simon just pointed out, they've got a big professional services component of their operations, and CrowdStrike actually kind of does a lot of the MSP's work. I mean, if a company has CrowdStrike but also has a managed security provider as well, there's going to be a duplication of effort there. So that's why CrowdStrike doesn't do too well in partnering with these MSPs. They're almost like competitors. But SentinelOne's seen this. Like SentinelOne is literally they're like 14 months older than CrowdStrike. So they've been seeing kind of the flaws in CrowdStrike's business model and just making tweaks. Like they've got a last mover advantage over CrowdStrike. So with the autonomous software, and also how they're dealing with the partner ecosystem, it's quite refreshing to see as an investor, because they are partnering and enhancing these third party service providers, while CrowdStrike is competing with them. And it's all scalability. It just means that if they can get in, really have good relationship with these MSPs, it's just going to bring even more scale to the business. Yeah, so And
Great,
also
thanks.
with it, Francis, you also mentioned about the gross margin. So CrowdStrike's gross margin is around 73%. I'm talking GAAP, not non-GAAP. But they have their data centers in co-location centers. So when so Sentinel One's gross margin has bumped up a lot, about 900 basis points in the last year. I think about 400 quarter on quarter, and this is indicative of the amazing revenue growth they've achieved, and also integrating Scalar, who have a really good ability in log management, and therefore they can gradually bring down Sentinel One's costs down. But when Sentinel One right now is in the public cloud, so when we mentioned this in the article, when companies get to a certain size, it makes sense for them to move away from the cloud because the benefits of multi-tenancy kind of degrade, and it makes sense for them to go into a co-location facility, you know, where they kind of co-own their own data center. And so when they do that, which I mean, we can't predict when they'll do it, but it should be, considering Sentinel One's gross margin now is 67% and CrowdStrike's is 73%, and they've made this big improvement with just being in the public cloud. When they eventually go co-location, then their gross margin should be considerably higher than CrowdStrike's. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Simon?
Yeah, I think I'm actually pretty surprised to see that Sentinel One improves the gross margin so quickly from like 55% to 68% recently. And that's also under the context that some people are speculating that it's selling cheap against CrowdStrike, and we believe that that is partially true because compared to CrowdStrike, Sentinel One is offering tons of functions for free, while CrowdStrike, as part of their cross-sell scheme, they want to provide more function and package it into independent modules and price it at a premium price, while Sentinel One just bundle all of them together and offer these multiple functions for free. So naturally, you should expect that they are selling cheaper than CrowdStrike, and their gross margin should be lower than CrowdStrike. But I'm pretty surprised to see that they are using the cloud as the infrastructure, but they can reach the gross margin that is very close to CrowdStrike, which has a huge operation in the co-location space. So just give more context about the gross margin. So if you think about what's their biggest cost of the cost of goods sold, is about the data hosting cost, because what's different with these next generation antivirus companies is that they need tons of space to store that client data. So the data hosting cost and the cost to compute to do the computer correlation analysis over this vast amount of data is huge. So inevitably, you should see their gross margin at lower than 80%. So this is different from guys like Asana who have less data usage, so they can reach gross margin higher than 90% easily. And going back to Sentinel One, I think it's pretty easy for us to see that in the future, as they scale up, they can reach the gross margin profile at around 80%, because at the moment with the cloud, they can reach 68% of the gross margin. And if they can, just like CrowdStrike, so CrowdStrike, when they was at a scale of Sentinel One, like ARR around 200 million, their gross margin was around like 55%. So Sentinel One at this similar ARR size is already way higher in terms of gross margin. So we are pretty positive, and this is also what the management has guided. The management guided their long-term gross margin at around 75% to 80%. Yeah.
Right.
So
Right. And so just we're gonna come back to that in a bit. We're gonna come back to this gross margins because that's you guys have mentioned some really fascinating points that I'd love us to dig into, because I could see this both on the gross margins as well as in the bottom lines in terms of the sales and marketing costs even declining over time because of the unique go-to-market strategy and pricing strategies between both businesses. But I want us to go back a little bit to our kind of where we started the conversation with regards to the general scalability of the platform itself and some of the points that you mentioned. And I'll like Muji to step just to kind of put his own thoughts in a little bit. But very quickly, someone wants to know, someone just put me a question, and please, for anyone, please feel free to send questions. I mean, whether it be over DM or over messages. And after we've gotten Muji's thoughts, we could open it up for very quick Q&A before we move on with our conversation. Just put that at the back of your minds. But very quickly, do you guys want to maybe explain what configuration changes are? Like, that was a question I just got from someone, and maybe just talk very, very briefly about that, and then we'll kind of get back into that scalability conversation. So one of you could just take that very
Yeah,
quickly.
maybe I will take this. So before we begin with this, I think there are tons of context missing with MITRE attack, because I think MITRE attack is a great source of information, because it's it's a very unique test, because the MITRE is founded by the US government, and the MITRE attack framework is used by the Cybersecurity and the Infrastructure Security Agency under the FBI. So it has that kind of prestige, unlike other antivirus tests that some of you might know that they can be very biased at times, and many people are just very skeptical about the integrity of the test results. But with MITRE attack, we have this unbiased test that is prioritize its objective around the national security objectives. So that's very good. But the bad thing about the MITRE is that because its objective is to raise the bar of the cybersecurity across the nation, it doesn't really rank each product individually. It doesn't give you a score to say, oh, this one is better than the other. But what they give is a very comprehensive result of each section of the test that is harder for an ordinary guy to interpret. And it also gives these vendors a great room for marketing, because all of them can claim that we are the winner, and they can just paint their way of narrative, and that is good for their marketing purposes. But what we are talking about with MITRE so far is about the test of EDR function. So we are not talking about preventing the virus. It's about just letting the attackers, the hackers, hacking the system, and see how your software is able to observe the techniques used by the hackers. So this is the primary objective. And so it's pretty easy for any vendor to game the test. Why? Because your primary objective is not to prevent the threat, but to detect each single step. So you can configure the software during the test to optimize for each attack technique. So it's pretty easy for a legacy vendor, including guys like Trend Micro and the Symantec, that CrowdStrike and SentinelOne are replacing in. And what's interesting about them is that they also achieved one of the highest overall score in terms of the detection, because they can make lots of configuration changes during each step of the attack. And what we are seeing is that CrowdStrike does something similar like the legacy antivirus companies. They have done tons of configuration changes during each attack technique. So that's something we don't like to see, because in terms of the Palo Alto networks and the SentinelOne, they don't make too much changes. So that's really a sharp contrast.
Okay, good. and that makes a lot of sense. And just so in general, and I think what you guys were giving us the background with those configuration changes are they're almost essentially the steps or like the techniques or measures that you take to deal with a specific threat, or maybe once a threat has been identified on the system after maybe a malware has been in the system for a few days, what are the steps and the measures that you take? And so those are generally kind of those configuration stages that are being taken. And what you guys were giving us with MITRE, quite frankly, um, is could you guys maybe mute? Because sometimes I think my voice is just echoing for a little bit whenever we're on. But in general, what I should say is just for the person who asked that question, is regards to the course, those configuration changes are primarily from MITRE's evaluation. So MITRE and everything that Simon just explained, MITRE tracks the process, the steps, the techniques, and different measures in which a normal security operations team would need to take, or how to deal with a particular threat or particular intelligence. So I just wanted us to kind of just clarify that. And you guys have talked about the integrity of MITRE's report as well. So that's perfect. But just back to our scalability and product architecture discussion and what you guys have just measured, I want to get to Muji actually at this point, really, to kind of just let Muji kind of pipe in on his perspective on what he thinks. I'd love to hear what you think, Muji, from the product architecture differences that the Simon and Jordan have given us.
Yeah, sure, Francis. Great space. Thanks to Convequity for chatting about cybersecurity on a Saturday. It is yeah, it's all the structure of the platform is as described. I like to equate it to CrowdStrike being a two-tier, agent to cloud architecture, whereas Sentinel-1 has a three-tier because they embed AI alongside the agent, and so they can be making more decisions, kind of get more of that autonomy that was described. Um, about the only thing I thought maybe was a little unfair in all of that as a CrowdStrike holder was the disparaging of their professional services, which is uh, the fact that they do absolutely have a human element to their business with professional services, in that they get hired to remediate breaches, even for their people who are not currently their customers. And so there's a bit of a human element with their threat graph side of things, where they're constantly monitoring, as I'm sure uh, Sentinel-1 is as well, the overall landscape over all customers within the EDR or XDR platform. Both of them are going to have that, but CrowdStrike has a remediation service on top of all this. It's not part of the, I guess, friction of the product. It's more, in my eyes, that they can swoop in and kind of help save the day, and which in turn actually becomes a funnel, because those customers that have that instant remediation tend to start using their services more and more. But otherwise, yeah, can't the architecture is as described, and I appreciate all the insights.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Muji. Do you guys have anything to add really quickly, Simon, Jordan, just before we move on?
Yeah, maybe just on the scalability side. So talking about the scalability, you can see the configuration change. So put the MITRE attacks configuration changes into context. So if you let's say you are an ordinary small and medium business, and you are trying to use Sentinel-1 and CrowdStrike. So the issue with CrowdStrike here is that yes, we can detect all the steps. We have clear visibility, but it requires you to have a trained analyst who is able to operate and make the configuration changes according to the context. While Sentinel-1, you can just hire an ordinary IT manager and just run the software without configuration changes. So that also impacts the scalability part of the story. Yeah, that would be
Perfect. Perfect. And yeah, just to even summarize it, because I guess we kind of had this conversation early on, and for maybe to provide more context for people, is with CrowdStrike's implementation and to install a CrowdStrike for a corporation, you generally need an advanced level of expertise. You generally need security operation analyst or security analyst at a company who is at a level 2 or at a level 3 to help implement a CrowdStrike large scale deployment. I mean, SMBs could have modules they could actually purchase from CrowdStrike, but in general, a lot of CrowdStrike's products actually require a little bit more advanced training. Meanwhile, for a huge component of SentinelOne's products, it's primarily an IT generalist, like a network architect. Like, for example, in Canada, you actually, one of a software developer that I know, he's a network security and network analyst. Like, he doesn't have a huge background in cybersecurity as much, but he's been utilizing a lot of SentinelOne's product because and this is exactly what he told me, it's extremely easy to install on the platform, and it didn't require an advanced or a higher level of training as an SOFC, which is a security analyst professional, whatever, at a higher level. And so one of the things you guys have mentioned, which makes a lot of sense, is just the fact that over time you could easily find more people, and the total addressable market is potentially even larger for SentinelOne because it's just a lot more easy to install. You need basic knowledge and security and endpoints to install. While meanwhile for CrowdStrike, you might need a lot more of this advanced one. So that was one key thing that hit the nail. I think another piece that you guys mentioned on the scalability front, and maybe let's touch on this very briefly, is SentinelOne's go-to-market strategy. I find it pretty unique in the sense that the go-to-market, they're very, very focused. And actually, even on the last earnings call, they keep talking about the partner ecosystem, and they're extremely focused on using all of their ecosystem partners to drive the sales of the product and those MSPs. And that's another thing that over time, if they do this quite well, could be a scalable means of getting the product out to the market. So maybe let's talk on that go-to-market strategy
Yeah.
and the product components.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, I mean, I think SentinelOne's go-to-market strategy is highly differentiated. They have, similar to CrowdStrike, they have the managed services to help these companies that don't have a security operations center. So they kind of do the services element of it. They can also, with what they introduced recently, the storyline active response, known as STAR, and also they've introduced a new feature called the remote script orchestration. To me, these facilities help security analysts write scripts to customize responses to threats according to their peculiarities of their environment. And I know that vendors offer analyst scripting ability, but it really does seem like a step up. To me, it just seems like a step towards the platform as a service, right? A step towards PaaS, maybe a quasi PaaS, because you're giving these security analysts the ability to customize responses, and it's a really effective way to combat the ever-changing cyber threats, right? So you've got the services, kind of quasi PaaS potentially. It might be a stretch calling it a platform as a service, but then also you've got the autonomous element, which is just, I guess, the SaaS, right? It just does what it says on the tin. So you've got SentinelOne's got this multi-pronged multi-layered approach where it's got services, we'll just call it quasi PaaS, and then you've got SaaS. And it's just for covering all bases and partnering with these incident response units and MSPs is just giving them great scale, because these guys love using their software because it makes their job so much easier. And there's no duplication of effort. And also security professionals within these enterprises are going to love SentinelOne because they kind of SentinelOne's taken the approach that no matter how good their agent is with all the AI and the autonomous working, there's always going to be threats that it won't detect. So it's kind of putting the power in the hand of the security analysts and letting them do their own thing and customize accordingly. But also at the bottom end, you've got the SaaS as well. So I think it's great. It's a great strategy, and it's kind of more multi-dimensional in my opinion compared to CrowdStrike. Maybe Simon or Muji wants to add to that. I don't know.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of few things. So again, we need to give more context around this topic. So I think what's interesting about SentinelOne, and this is really heightened my conviction over SentinelOne, is that the CEO understand that you not only need a good technology, you also need good marketing. So they spent years in polishing and making the platform complete, and then they just recently push the pedal and ignite their sales and marketing machine. And that's pretty different compared to CrowdStrike. I think CrowdStrike, they just 2 years after the founding, they launched their product, their EDR product immediately. So they follow the typical software, the SaaS business model, which is to develop MVP, which is minimum viable product first, and then gradually expand, build up your platform. So that's pretty different. And in terms of their sales channel, I think it's pretty natural for CrowdStrike to increase their margin and really leverage SaaS businesses land and expand strategy via more direct sales. So it's pretty natural for them to disintermediate the existing two-tier sales model, which you have a distributor and then manage the security service provider. So they wanted to replace the role of the middleman, which is the MSSP, and they wanted to do it by themselves. This is good in the long term, but what's interesting is that SentinelOne strikes CrowdStrike's weak spot in terms of the sales channel, because they found that MSSPs are not satisfied with CrowdStrike because the latter is kind of competing with MSSP directly. And so by working with MSSPs, SentinelOne is able to gain the leverage and grow more quickly. And what's interesting is that right now, CrowdStrike's revenue is like 73% comes from the US market, while for SentinelOne, they have like 33% coming from the international market, and it is growing faster than the US business. So I think this better channel relationship gives SentinelOne a better leverage, and it targets CrowdStrike's weak spot perfectly. And in terms of pricing, it's also pretty interesting that SentinelOne targets CrowdStrike's weak spot also very perfectly. They basically bundle everything together with more functions. So they have like 3 SKUs primarily, while CrowdStrike has like 10 or more modules that you need to buy individually. And that isn't necessarily bad, because CrowdStrike wanted to have this land and expand, increase their dollar-based net retention number every year. But just think about one specific case. For example, SentinelOne, they includes USB device control for free in their bundle, while CrowdStrike sells it as an independent module. So you have to pay more. It's around like 140% more compared to Sentinel-1 if you want to have your USB device control secured. And as a customer, you must buy it because there's no way for you to secure a device without securing the USB control. But for CrowdStrike, they are asking customers to pay more and individually, while Sentinel-1 is kind of providing it for free and in the bundle, and you don't need to worry about the pricing and enabling the license. So I think overall, Sentinel-1 just managed to create a better customer relationship in terms of the pricing and the product bundle.
Interesting. Very, very, very quickly, Muji, did you have anything to just in general on the go-to-market approach and the differences between both platforms? Anything to add or contribute or?
I just don't understand the 2 points that were made that Sentinel-1 is exploiting something that CrowdStrike's not doing. I didn't really follow that at all. CrowdStrike's got 3/4 of its revenue coming from channel partners versus its direct to sales per its latest 10Q. And so they both, rely on partners. This isn't unusual and they both want to build ecosystems, around that. There was some mention that MSSPs might be disappointed that, CrowdStrike is absolutely competing against them. Yet I do see partnerships emerging that are using the endpoint protection portions of it, and then other companies extend from there with their own unique blend of managed services on top of it. So it does exist in CrowdStrike's ecosystem. So I guess I'm just not seeing what's so unusual between the two platforms, or where there's, some way that Sentinel-1 is doing go-to-market better, especially when I see the S&M just rising, pretty co-equally to top-line growth. Not exactly. It's like in the 90s versus well over 100% for revenue and ARR growth. But I love to see the gross margins rising, but at the same time have some hesitations around the massive growth in sales that they have to do to support that.
Very quickly, maybe just one of you could just opine really quickly on that point.
Just on the MSSP part, I think Muji's point is actually pretty valid, because if you take a look at CrowdStrike's most recent earnings call, the CEO said that they grew their MSSP channel sales also in triple digit. So they are still growing very fast with MSSPs. So, but my point is that this is something over the longer term, over the future, when Sentinel-1 and CrowdStrike will compete more fiercely and head to head, I think that would be the differentiation by then. But so far, what we are seeing is that in terms of MSSPs, CrowdStrike is still able to grow the market. And I think what's missing here is the market structure, because in my opinion, so if we can normalize the technology deed, so I think Sentinel-1 is probably 10 to 20% better than CrowdStrike in terms of technology, but CrowdStrike is more than 100% better than other legacy antivirus companies. So they have this huge runway to replace the existing customers without having really to compete head to head with Sentinel-1 and kind of coming into the zero-sum game. Your market share is my lose. So we are not seeing that yet. So, and according to Sentinel-1's narrative, they are saying that around more than 50% of the market is still occupied by the legacy antivirus companies. And in my opinion, it's probably coming into like 80%. So there's still tons of room for CrowdStrike to replace the existing vendors. So they don't really have to meet with that MSSP pressure at the moment. But I think in 3 or 5 years time, when they grow their ARR into say 5 billion or more, maybe they will see this pressure.
Yeah, and just to kind of really quickly, just to really very quick point there on how big the entire market really is. I just actually saw that data just literally actually today, actually early today. It was I believe Microsoft, Trend Micro, and McAfee and Symantec, they control roughly at about 50 to 60, about 50% of the entire legacy market, pretty much the endpoint market. And I think CrowdStrike is at about 6 to 7%, and SentinelOne's at like maybe 2%. So, I mean, yeah, just to kind of echo up your point, is the market is quite big, quite frankly. And these guys, even though CrowdStrike is approaching 1.7 or 1.8 billion ARR, and certain ones that only 200 million, they still have a huge amount of displacing of legacy partners. So yeah, no, that's good. Very quickly, someone just sent me this question, and I want to make sure I put it out there. Um, they just wanted to ask you about this constant displacement methods by the whole jab that was given by CrowdStrike CEO on the earnings call, when he gave that example of a customer who decided to leave SentinelOne in place of, I think they removed SentinelOne's platform, in a university that removes that platform in place of CrowdStrike. Do you guys look into that example, and do you have maybe any comments to see what actually happened in that specific example, and maybe if that's a weak point actually for SentinelOne as well?
Yeah,
I,
maybe I will take
yeah,
this one.
yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's pretty common around, because so far SentinelOne has like 7,000 customers, and you inevitably you will see one or two customers switching back and forth. And to this example given by CrowdStrike more specifically, this is a hospital that previously uses CrowdStrike's solution, and they switched to SentinelOne, and after that they found that it isn't ideal. They are lacking some function that they were using on CrowdStrike, so they moved back to CrowdStrike. So I think this is kind of a peculiar, kind of a special edge case, not the normal case. And speaking of the data point where we can um, see the picture more clearly, I think we can use the gross net retention. So if you think about the customer churn, and how many customers move away from your platform each year. And so far, it's all really interesting, because SentinelOne, their gross retention is consistently around 97%. And this is pretty rare, because their ARR is around 240 only. So if you think about CrowdStrike, when their ARR was around 200 million, their gross retention was around like 93%. So in the early of your journey, your product isn't too mature, you didn't serve too much enterprises. It's pretty natural for you to see one or two customers going away, and then maybe they will go back sometime in the future. But what's interesting is that the gross retention for SentinelOne at such an early stage is already pretty high. So we are not too concerned about the early CrowdStrike replacing SentinelOne.
And you go ahead, Jordan. You wanted to add something on that point.
Yeah, I was just going to add that in fierce rivalries between these security vendors, we've seen it with Zscaler and Palo Alto Networks, and now it's with CrowdStrike and SentinelOne. The CEOs, they can bring up these individual cases, but not really give any context and any details, and rightly so, that for confidentiality reasons we can't. But there's always going to be these individual edge cases. So yeah, you can't really look too much into that. I think you just need to look at the numbers, as Simon's pointed out, the 97% gross retention rate, compared to where CrowdStrike was when they was at a similar annual recurring revenue rate. They was at 93%. So yeah, it's I just don't think we should look too much into individual cases like that, because every security vendor has them, but they are going to come to the fore more so between CrowdStrike and SentinelOne, because it's all part of the games that they play.
Great. Okay, great. So we're gonna wrap it up. Kind of wrap up this whole. I think if anyone has any, I wish I could take all the questions on SentinelOne and CrowdStrike. I'll be happy. We could take it over DMs or just send us messages, and Simon and Jordan would be happy to end it. But I just want to wrap up this phase with Mujis. Do you have anything to add in final words just before we talk about Fortinet and Palo Alto networks? Do you have anything to add, Muji, before we wrap up?
I mean, I completely agree with the comments that the mudslinging is just that. Although with Zscaler and Palo Alto, you maybe had more of the stalwart of the industry in Palo Alto, and then Zscaler as the upstart. And with CrowdStrike, they're both the disruptive format. As was mentioned, there's a lot of, not exactly greenfield, but there's a lot of legacy solutions out there that are kind of using the older methods that still need to upgrade. And especially as companies move into zero trust and SASE networks through these partnerships that companies like CrowdStrike and SentinelOne are building with those platforms, is that they kind of bolt on, like you bolt on an identity provider. With Okta, you can bolt on a device management system with CrowdStrike and SentinelOne. So I absolutely agree. There's a lot of, as people like to say, the rising tide is going to lift all boats here. All these companies are going to do well. But for me, between CrowdStrike and SentinelOne, I just continue to look at the financials profiles of these companies. And it's interesting in this particular case that we have the exact example, as was talked about, maybe a last mover advantage from SentinelOne coming late, or gaining momentum later, maybe to start to rival where CrowdStrike had all that success. But we can exactly compare and contrast the financial profile as it went through CrowdStrike from IPO onward. We can kind of compare that to SentinelOne, and that's where I continue to kind of focus, is that difference in the underlying financial metrics of these two companies.
Gotcha.
Yeah, maybe I should add, because we discuss a lot about fundamentals, but we don't touch too much on the valuation. So just a quick comment on the valuation. I think for the hyper growth names, especially for ones that are growing more than 100% year over year, it's always very hard to do the valuation. But from our valuation, kind of checking what the market is pricing in. So the market is kind of pricing in about 80% year over year growth for SentinelOne next year, and kind of going down into 60% 2 years later. So that's kind of the general expectation. That would give us a valuation about 13 billion. So which is what SentinelOne is currently trading at. And what's the upside potential? I think Snowflake is a pretty good analogy. So the company went public last year, and many people were speculating that when the growth will really start to decay. And it kind of really surprised all of us that the growth is still there, more than 100%. So the multiple just keeps expanded. And what we will see from SentinelOne, I think it's pretty interesting. If we are going to project the growth rate to a more persistent, higher than 80% level for just one or two more quarters, then its valuation could easily go into, say, 20 billion, which means that the stock price can double easily from now. So yeah, just my comment on that.
Great. Thanks for that. And just, I guess we're not gonna have a crazy amount of time left, quite frankly. But you guys have done a lot of work actually on Fortinet and Palo Alto networks. Actually, I think actually Jordan, I believe you were one of the first people who called Fortinet actually early into the year. Actually, you were really early, and I know congratulations because you've made a lot. I think it's probably the best performing cybersecurity stock here to date, Fortinet, and it's still doing really well. So maybe give us a very high level overview, quite frankly, of like what's the thesis with Fortinet, um, and yeah, what's primarily the thesis
Yeah.
with them, and what do you think is a unique value proposition that they have to offer, especially because I know you have some interesting comments about Zscaler as well. So maybe if you want to compare and contrast really quickly, an
Yeah,
overview.
sure. So one key trend for Fortinet, similar to Palo Alto Networks, is the vendor consolidation trends. And along with Palo Alto Networks, Fortinet has the broadest of cybersecurity platforms. So that's a key trend. Um, Clearly, we're most of the listeners may be aware of a trend in network security called SASE, which it stands for Secure Access Service Edge. Um, this was a term defined by Gartner in 2019, which describes the converging of networking and security together. And it kind of, as the castle and moat perimeter network security was becoming less effective because even before the pandemic, people were workforces were becoming more distributed, and there was apps in the cloud that they was accessing, not just their apps in their own private data centers. So Gartner said, right, there needs to be some sort of some change here. And they describe SASE, which is, as I say, converged networking and security, where um, they vendors will be in a POP, a point of presence, and they will receive traffic, inspect it, and then pass it on its way either to wherever the user wants to connect to, whether it's an app in the cloud or an app even in their company's own private data center. So that's SASE. To basically it just makes sense to do it that way rather than backhaul a user's traffic all the way into the corporate network and then back out to the cloud. So with Fortinet, for me, I like to describe them as the most accommodative SASE player because they can deliver SASE according to Gartner's original definition back in 2019 when they introduced the term. But we can also deliver it on premises, and we can also even deliver it in a home office network. Um, and that is because right from the beginning when Fortinet was founded in 2000, they focused on software and hardware together and how they can integrate the two, with a big focus on ASIC chips. Um, and over the years, they've managed to refine the security functionality and the networking side as well. And now they are able to pack all of these networking and security functions into one compact box, which is FortiGate. So whereas on-prem, a network administrator may have to deal with like different boxes like a load balancer, VPN, a secure web gateway, a firewall. Now with Fortinet, you can have all this networking and security function in one compact box. So it makes network administrating a whole lot easier. And because of that, they can deliver this converged networking and security at the same time. It's as Gartner describes, its original definition was that it had to be SASE had to be conducted in a POP, away from premises, in a separate data center, work as like the middleman between the user and wherever that user wants to connect to. Fortinet can do it that way, but we can do it also in on-prem and even in at the home, because just say it's so compact. This box is so compact and affordable that it can be positioned anywhere and deliver this SASE, like secure, converged networking and security. So they've kind of growth suffered a little bit during 2020 due to the lockdowns a little bit, but it was still above 20%. But now during 2021, and with most people have kind of got this mix of working in the office and working at home, there's these IT projects are back on the table. Like there's this more of a hybrid working environment. And Fortinet has benefited tremendously from that because they can deliver SASE for hybrid environments, in the cloud, in the POP, on-prem, or for people, for key employees at home that need, corporate-like security for their home network. So they benefited tremendously from that. And in the third quarter, the latest quarter, product revenue growth was 50%, and subscription revenue growth was about 30%. So unbelievable, really. So that's why we like Fortinet. And going forward, it's going to be these hybrid environments are going to persist, obviously. So going forward, I think again they're just going to benefit by being the most accommodative SASE player, and also they're going to benefit because of the consolidation trends as well.
Great. That's great. And just I think I shared this a few weeks back. I shared that Okta has this way. I have no idea how they do it, but every year they have the fastest growing apps that they do this globally. And as I mentioned in that tweet a few weeks back, that report has always, you've always seen really high potential companies come out of that Okta report. Like in the past, Datadog, like Zoom, Snowflake has always been. But uniquely, Fortinet's FortiGate, the FortiGate apps, which you just mentioned, is able to actually put all these core components of networking and security into one. Has actually been one of the fastest growing apps amongst most others. I actually haven't seen all the cybersecurities, and so definitely that's a huge part that's actually driving a major part of their growth right now. So yeah, that's something I do find interesting. And you're not
I have
very
a question right quick,
sure.
actually. Um, we see obviously disruption happens in cybersecurity all the time, and a lot of these tech trends that have come up, like observability. We saw this with Splunk. Really had its cash cow with kind of on-premise licensing, and was slow to adopt recurring revenue, was slow to adopt the cloud, and really had to pivot its ship. And that's kind of where I put Palo Alto and Fortinet a little bit, and that they had such a appliance firewall based product line that it's in turn that they've started pivoting to more cloud native environments and adapting into that. And obviously they're having enormous success with that. I was wondering if Convequity, do you guys break out when you're studying those companies, what is kind of net new customers versus customers that they're adapting kind of from the older paradigm or older architecture to the newer? Do they break those numbers out?
Well, I think maybe I can give a bit of color on that. So, for example, if you take a look at Palo Alto Network, they have this SaaS-based next generation security business division. So they have about 2,000 customers, and their core firewall business has around 57,000 customers. And within that 2,000 customers in their cutting edge cloud security, they have about 400 that are new, and 1400 that are share the in common, share the firewall business in common. So that will give you kind of a sense. So it's both. It's the new customers adopting their solution, but also the existing customers switching to their newer offerings.
Great, thanks. That's helpful. If only because I feel like the pivots that these really gorillas in the space have to do to kind of adapt to the new architecture styles is that they really have to, I don't know, circle the wagons a little bit to stave off customer loss. But at the same time, I feel like that they're cannibalizing their other side, but that's what you want to see. So it's you got to just understand that, I guess, as you're reading the financials, is that they're adapting their own customers as well as obviously then trying to sell into new.
Yeah, I think this is what market is missing with Palo Alto Networks and the Fortinet as well. So I think generally the market discounts these two names because they think that they are kind of the legacy names. They don't grow that much, and even if they introduce new products, the new products revenue will eat their existing legacy kind of the business revenue. But what we are seeing with Fortinet especially is that all of their revenues are growing, so they have increasing demand for the firewall. They also have increasing demand for SASE. So there is no conflict and there's no taking share from one to the another. So that's a pretty striking part. And I think what's behind it is that the demand for hardware is out layer. So it's kind of shocking to many analysts because we believe that cloud is the future. So there's no room for on-premise equipment. But if you think about the infrastructure, in the end of the day, you still need the equipment, the router, to do the infrastructure kind of the service. And that's the part where Fortinet has been growing into. So with the SD-WAN, they are not only about the firewall, they are able to provide the WAN edge infrastructure to everyone. And that opens up a huge market. So I think that's also pretty shocking to us. And furthermore, it opens a room for not only the security service, it's about the productivity. You can help. And one example for the SD-WAN is that it enables the zero-touch provisioning. So in the beginning of the pandemic, you are in a lockdown, and it's pretty hard for you to manage new devices. But with Fortinet, with SD-WAN, you can just ship the equipment to the place you want to host, and then you can manage it on the cloud. So that's a pretty promising part of the story as well. And I think that's pretty missing because people believe that Fortinet and Palo Alto Networks are the legacy names and they can't do this kind of new stuff.
Yeah. It's interesting. Let's just quickly discuss the evaluation of Fortinet. Interestingly, we'll just use Guru Focus to filter some stocks and find some a suitable peer group for Fortinet. And I found 109 US-based software stocks plus communication equipment vendors. So 109 stocks. And their rule of 40, which is their trailing 12-month revenue growth plus free cash flow margin, which is also trailing 12-month, they are in the top 4% on the rule of 40. However, their forward free cash flow multiple is in the bottom 8%. Now that just shows you how Fortinet is delivering this growth and the free cash flow margin, and clearly there's some sort of legacy attachment that investors are adding to the stock. Probably kind of touching on what Muji mentioned about there is this legacy attachment to Fortinet, but I think it's unjust really, because growth is accelerating. They are delivering they're pretty much the best vendor for delivering these hybrid use cases as companies need to transform following the pandemic. And as I say, Rule of 40 is in the top 4% of this cohort, but their forward free cash flow multiple is in the bottom 8%. And a multiple we like to use is the enterprise value divided by gross profit. Often because the kind of like EBITDA or free cash flow can be volatile for high growth companies. But at the same time, using a sales multiple sometimes doesn't give you enough insight. So gross profit sometimes is a nice in between to give you an indicator of value once the company kind of matures. So the Fortinet's enterprise value divided by gross profit and then divided by growth, which is similar to the PEG factor, price to earnings divided by growth. That is at the 40th percentile. So again, Rule of 40 is in the top 4%, but their enterprise value divided by gross profit divided by growth is below the median, at the
And
40th.
it's a good point. I actually think this year, I mean, they're one of the best performing names this year, but I think there's a, what do they call it, the shadow in the room or within this industry in Zscaler. It appears like Zscaler has they've they've almost taken all the multiple away from the market is pretty much discounting that due to Zscaler's cloud native infrastructure, right? The fact that Zscaler was built for the ground and for the cloud and by the cloud and for the cloud completely in this work from anywhere environment. The fact that their architecture is pretty much one of the leading zero trust architecture and was just one of the best in terms of how they've built it. And obviously, we've seen the growth that Zscaler has compounded quite astonishingly, like literally over the last 5 years. And funny enough, this year would be probably when they're approaching over $1 billion. They're actually accelerating growth in the high 60s, which is just amazing. So I think what might be happening, and I would love to get you guys' and you guys have a pretty interesting opinion on Zscaler, is the market is discounting Zscaler as going to be the future leader of the market, and obviously a lot of the multiple has been awarded to Zscaler. So maybe now would be a good time, Jordan. Maybe you guys share the interesting perspective you gave me on Zscaler and why you guys think Zscaler wouldn't continue to do this at the expense of Fortinet.
Well, so we have contrarian views on Zscaler. I mean, they are benefiting from the tailwinds of the SASE and companies needing to transform. But from my perspective, I believe Simon would agree with this. There's question marks over how SaaS they are. Their SaaSness, if we can use that word. Just because, I mean, you look. I think going on the website and looking for pricing is often a good indicator. You go on the website and there's no pricing information. There's no pricing on SKUs. It's all kind of, you need to make a request to get pricing. There's no freemium plan, not even any free trials available. And you kind of compare it to the likes of Cloudflare and Okta and Asana. I know that's going off from security, but these are what we consider as cutting edge SaaS players. They're just very transparent with their pricing because they're taking the software defined everything to the nth degree, and they have better visibility. So that's kind of one reason that we think that, and I don't think this is going to be a headwind to their revenue growth in anytime soon, but it's just kind of just a contrarian view on how we view them in terms of their cutting edgeness. And there's also quite a few reports all over Reddit or wherever else that the deployment of Zscaler is never easy. There's always an issue. There's always several issues, but because of this Zscaler's top-down evangelical kind of a approach, where Jay Chowdhury is the salesman mastermind, and he's connecting with these CISOs and the CTOs, and it's just a very top-down approach to getting into these companies. But at the engineer level, there's issues with getting the software deployed. But up, at the CISO level, they're not really going to hear about them. But it's just, again, the issues with the deployment is not really aligned with being a cutting edge SaaS player. You don't kind of get these reports with Cloudflare, etc. So these are just indicators that they may not be the most cutting edge SaaS type of vendor. And then, there's a lack of bottom up approach. As I say, it's always top down, where you got Cloudflare. They kind of got a bottom up approach and a top down approach. But we've also done we went into depth in Zscaler a while ago, when we used to go into the culture and the leadership of companies, and we don't really do that now because it's just really time consuming. But what we found was that Jay Chowdhury is quite a micromanager. It's excessively micromanaging his company, which is kind of indicative. If you check LinkedIn, you can see the turnover in the sales and marketing functions, and you can also see the turnover in the chief marketing officer. It's changed. The chief marketing officer has changed 5 times in 4 years. So it's kind of, if you kind of put the pieces together, Chowdhury is kind of one of the main salespeople. He's actively on the road making these multi-million-dollar deals. And then you've got high turnover amongst the executive levels in the sales and marketing functions. You kind of reading between the lines, it looks like, there's a lot of micromanagement there. So, it kind of, we see parallels between Jay Chowdhury and the founder and CEO of Checkpoint Software, called Jill Schwed, and he has similar traits, in our opinion. And where we don't want to go too far with this, but it just seems like he has to be the one with all the ideas. And maybe Chowdhury is like that as well. He needs to be the one with all the ideas, and that's kind of not really, it's not really good for the long term. I mean, when Zscaler gets up to 1.5 billion revenue or 2 billion revenue, will they be able to continue this high growth, or slow the growth decay if with this top down only approach? I'm really unsure about that. But hey, yeah, Simon, you take over. You share some thoughts.
Yeah. I think maybe we should touch a little bit on the competition. So, in my opinion, Fortinet is not so much as a direct competitor to Zscaler, because Fortinet now is growing into the WAN edge infrastructure kind of a business. So they can coexist with Zscaler, and in many ways, they are the infrastructure partner for Zscaler. So Zscaler, their core business is the SASE, so it's the secure web gateway. That is a software form, kind of the network security, and they often get connected to the Fortinet router. So they are not so much of direct competitor. But Fortinet last year, they also introduced FortiSASE, and we think it's a pretty promising move, and it's yet to monetize this growth yet. But talking about more direct competition is Palo Alto Networks. They have this Prisma SASE, which we believe is, I think it's the most powerful competitor in the SASE space. And their ARR is actually somewhere around 1.8 billion, and it's growing at more than 60% as well. But it's a diamond in the rough. It's hidden in the huge corporate balance sheet of Palo Alto Network, which has a huge hardware firewall business as well. So the market is not appreciating that. And talking about SASE players, we're also seeing a private company called Netscope. We believe that the founder is very visionary, and they were the best of the breed in CASB, which is in the center of the cloud security really. And later they expanded into SASE, and they have hired the SVP of infrastructure from AWS. And they are really building up this huge point of presence globally. And we believe that they have a newer architecture, they have stronger product, but maybe not that much in terms of the marketing because they are not public yet and they are just earlier. They are younger than Zscaler for like 7 or 8 years. And then there is clearly Cloudflare. It leverages its edge compute, so they are able to do the DevOps, the agile developing, thanks to their edge compute on top of their CDN network. That is also pretty promising. So I think the competition is really uh, huge out there, but so far the market is kind of pricing that Zscaler will be the winner in the future. But according to our analysis, Zscaler's infrastructure is kind of aging, and they don't have the strongest product, but their marketing is really strong. So it kind of gives us a huge concern because when you grow into the size of, say, more than 2 billion in ARR, how can you continue to grow when others are catching up and they have newer architecture, they have better product? And this also gets us thinking about the moat for Zscaler. So is it the data they own, or is it the customer they have? And just gets me wondering, and I don't think their growth outlook is as stable as what the market is pricing in.
Yeah, so thanks for. I'm gonna let Muji come in a bit here to just kind of talk to you, but yeah, I think you guys have brought up different good points. I mean, it's good points that, like for example, I'm also extremely bullish on Zscaler, primarily because I actually think their architecture is actually ahead of the competition for the most part, in terms of just the way the product is architected, primarily around enterprise security. But I want to let Muji step in here. Maybe just he's done, obviously everyone knows Muji has done a lot of work on Zscaler as well. So Muji, I'll let you step in here. I want to hear what you have to say. Any thoughts that you have in general?
Yeah, can't argue with much of that. Zscaler is absolutely a pretty high friction add to Jordan's point, just in terms of no free tier, really not very transparent with pricing. I don't know if that really has anything to do with whether they're SaaS or not, but certainly go-to-market wise, they're not transparent at all. And then absolutely on the top-down part, they're striving for an upper management decision to adopt this kind of enterprise wide. So it's really the way I like to think of it is it's an all-in decision. You really have to adopt all of Zscaler, not piecemeal it into kind of existing solutions, or it's really hard to transition, which also explains why they're so heavily dependent on channel partners, in particular system integrators that have to come in and adapt. A company like GE was their huge marquee sale early on after their IPO. And, just imagine the complexity of, hundreds of thousands of users across thousands of networks that all have to be kind of adapted to this model. And I also agree with that Zscaler does like to partner with the SD-WANs. They, don't want to take that, I guess I'd say, kind of last mile capabilities away. They want to serve as kind of the interconnective glue from enterprises there. But it's one of those companies where you just can't ignore the acceleration that you were mentioning, Francis. That um, absolutely, I can't speak to any of the management concerns, but they absolutely had a marketing stumble that they seemingly rectified, but they rectified it by heading straight long into the pandemic and all the tailwinds that brought. And so it's a company I watch closely, but it's because they're accelerating right now. It's remains pretty high on my conviction list, just with the SASE play in general and trying to become the kind of interconnective backbone for networks. I think it really speaks to that lack of talent a little bit. In that's why these platforms are so attractive. Is that it's hard enough to find IT staff, much less than once you find IT staff, you have to keep their skill sets up to date with the latest attack techniques and security wise. And now you can just kind of offload all that. So these are very expensive platforms to adopt, but you're really offloading a huge portion of your IT spend that would normally be dedicated to not only appliances, but then the staff to maintain those appliances, upkeep them, maintain them, patch them, constantly be on the lookout for threats and breaches. And so you're kind of offloading that portion into these companies, whether SD-WAN, which is kind of, as I mentioned, that last mile of how am I connecting the various pieces and locations of my network or physical locations together, versus SASE, which to me is, a zero trust model over a connective network plane where all of that is offloaded, your entire networking backbone. The SD-WAN is still a part of that. It's not replacing. They're actually very complementary in that the SD-WAN is controlling the last mile, regardless of where that last mile is, whether it's interconnecting, over telco connections or interconnecting into a centralized, kind of network plane like SASE provides. So it's another area where it's, rising tide is lifting all boats. This is the overall trend because of that staff shortage. I feel like that you can really offload a lot of this to the experts in both networking and security. But very frictionless, very friction-filled company, I should say, in that it's very hard to adapt and requires a lot of custom work from system integrators. So.
And I think me and Jordan, we had this conversation about with Zscaler too, the fact that it's a corporate wide product. Like when you use Zscaler, it's not like a Cloudflare where I'm just in a startup or I'm just a developer and I need some firewall services or whatever services from Cloudflare. I could easily just go up on their page and pretty much they have some freemium free subscriptions on there, or I could very easily pay, get it up and running on my applications, and bang, I'm good to go. But you don't have that with Zscaler. It's generally a product where you need it across the entire enterprise. It's a company that's very global in multiple headquarters, and you need to secure that entire network. And as a result of that, you can't just have a bunch of developers making those decisions. You need to have your CTO or your director of IT making those large scale decisions, but we could go on and on and Zscaler.
Hey, Francis.
Yeah.
Just to let you know, I don't know if it's just my end, but your audio is way worse than it was before for some reason.
Yeah, same here. I'm hearing that as well, Francis.
Okay.
So we heard everything you said, but it's like you're talking through a tube.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. And so this is the final part. Like I have only about 10 minutes here before I want us to wrap up the spaces, and it's just to talk about what's happening within the SaaS ecosystem. So Convequity and Simon actually did do a lot of work into evaluating the crop of SaaS businesses in 2007, the '08 crisis, as opposed to the crop of businesses that we have right now, and they did some work on looking at what's the differences between those businesses as opposed to now. And they've actually, they do know a lot about the macro environment, valuations, and if we're in a bubble, right, and how that plays out. So I know we don't have as much time, but on a high level, Jordan and Simon, maybe you guys just wrap up the conclusion of your studies and what
Yeah.
you guys see going forward with technology, especially with the macro environment and the taper and all these conversations we have right now.
Right. Okay. Well, yes, we earlier this year, around March, April time, we the markets were the same conversation early in the year is now. Where is the market in a bubble? In particular, our software stocks in a bubble. And Simon and I got thinking, and we just had a hunch and thought, shall we our software stocks perhaps richly priced at the moment because perhaps they're fundamentally different to software stocks of the past. So we decided to try and test that qualitatively and quantitatively. So we decided to start with gross margins, and because gross margins, as we've spoke about, they are indicative of the underlying economics of a company. So we thought, right, if we can discern any differences between today's software stocks gross margins and software stocks in the previous era, then that might give us some direction. So we decided to take a cohort of software stocks in 2021 and compare their gross margins to a cohort of software stocks in 2007. And the difference in the medians was quite large. There was an 850 basis point differential. So software stocks in 2021 had an 850 basis point higher gross margin. This wasn't statistically significant according to the rules of the tests that we used. However, the tests weren't aware of how difficult it is for firms to increase their gross margins, right? So we thought it was noteworthy, quite a meaningful difference. So later in the year, literally just a few weeks ago, we decided to revisit that. So we tested gross margins again between a cohort of software stocks in 2021 compared to 2007, but also tested for any differences in revenue growth decay, and also operating margins as well. And generally, what we found was there is evidence, although it's far from being conclusive, there's evidence that today's software stocks have high gross margins today than stocks in a pre-cloud era, i.e., that's why we chose 2007. And there's also evidence that revenue growth decay for today's software stocks is slower. And you kind of can back this up with kind of how the cloud and SaaS businesses function. So, but if going back to kind of the valuation side of it, if software stocks today have high gross margins, then that indicates that in the long term, once their operating expenditures normalize, that they will be potentially more profitable businesses than software stocks in pre-cloud eras. So that might be one reason why there's such rich valuations today. Maybe investors and the market is implicitly or explicitly acknowledging this and maybe attaching a premium to this. So not conclusive, but there's some evidence there. And then in regards to revenue growth decay, today's software stocks indicate that revenue growth decay is less than pre-cloud software stocks. And again, this would indicate that the growth runway is more sustainable. They can sustain high growth for longer. And again, this may explain the high valuations. If that is the case, then both high gross margins and slow revenue growth decay would imply higher cash flows and therefore higher valuations. So it's interesting, and it kind of makes sense in the cloud environment, right? Because gross margins can go higher because of the cloud, because of the multi-tenancy of the cloud, and all things that SaaS businesses excel at, with the software defined everything, and the virtualization, which means we don't need as many physical servers, and so we don't need as much data center space and as much hosting, etc. So this kind of can bring down the cost of revenue, and with the ability of the cloud, companies, these SaaS companies can produce new products faster, and they can enter new markets quicker also. So it provides that kind of scalability, and it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that gross margins could be higher because of that. And then with a slower revenue growth decay as well is also related to these software stocks being able to quickly pivot and create a new product and enter a new market, and just increase their TAM, extend that growth runway, and accelerate growth. So I mean, we've seen that with Cloudflare recently, and even ServiceNow and Zscaler. They can quickly produce new products and enter adjacent markets and deliver higher growth. So yeah, that's kind of the in a nutshell what we found. Quite interesting. It needs further research, and we will revisit it in a few months. But it kind of just indicates that it just makes you question: Are we in a bubble? Today's software stocks are certainly completely different to software stocks back in the .com era, where companies were being valued based on zero revenue, zero customers, just a concept. Today these companies are executing very, very well, and yeah, just food for thought, really. Simon, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just give you more context about why we started this kind of research, because it's pretty easy to be bearish on something, and usually the bears sound more intelligent and correct than the longs, especially when we are talking about the technology stock. So I think the prevailing narrative right now is that the market is in a bubble, and you have these crazy valuations in the technology stocks. And what was pretty intriguing to me is that what surprised lots of investors during the last decade is the outperformance of tech in general. So the tech is really the contributor to the performance of S&P 500 and Nasdaq. It's like more than 80% of the contribution. And what's behind it, I think, is that the market isn't pricing in the potential of technology properly. And it makes sense, because if they're going back to 2010, you may not expect Apple to be a $2.5 trillion company. And the same goes to Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. And I think a lot of that is the market is missing kind of the context. The market is always discounting the potential of technology. So we want to take a closer look into the fundamentals of the technology, instead of talking about the PE ratio only. And speaking of the valuation, if you think about the SaaS as in aggregate, they have expanded their enterprise value to sales ratio by a pretty sizable amount. So it's about so if we talk about 2015, the median EV to sales ratio for SaaS in general is about 5x, but now it's about like 15x. So that's a sizable multiple expansion. And is that warranted? That's another discussion. And to our analysis, a lot of that is warranted, because if you are pricing in the company that is growing at more than 30% in the future with a good margin profile, in our metric, it's high gross margin, because in the end of the day, for the SaaS company, their basic economics is um, the current customer, how much does it take for you to serve your existing customer this year? And usually their contribution margin is higher than 60%. So if you, in the future, when they don't grow, say their growth rate is 0%, their EBIT margin should be higher than 60%. That's our expectation. So if you price that in, their EV to sales ratio should be higher than 15x. So that's what we are seeing right now. And speaking of the recent multiple expansion, it's also pretty interesting, because for the we are seeing that this year's multiple expansion is led by high growth names. So only high growth, the guys growing at higher than 30% year over year growth rate, their multiples are expanding, while for the lower growth names, like the ones growing at less than 30%, their multiple actually contracted this year. So it's definitely not in a bubble if you are talking about the specifics. And that's also pretty contrarian if you are buying into the narrative of the public commentators. And
No, finish up.
just on the lower growth names, their multiple actually is flattened across from 2018 to 2021. And I think this is also a good proxy, because if you compare the relative performance between Russell 2000 and Nasdaq, which is comparing the mid cap names, small cap to mid cap names, they are relatively underperforming compared to the big cap names in the Nasdaq. And this has been a trend going on for like 5 years from now. So can we really argue that there is a bubble? So it's pretty questioning. So in my opinion, the bubble is largely confined in the high growth names. And for the large cap names, if you take a look at their enterprise to sales ratio, so say for take Apple for example, it's around like 8 times. And if you are considering they can grow at baseline of 10% each year with EBIT margin around 30%, then they are definitely not in a bubble. And that may explain why we will continue to see the market overall to melt up. Yeah.
Fascinating. That, like, yeah, there's so many really fascinating points you guys have just really highlighted there, from the gross margins differentials that today's businesses have, all the way down to why more companies are generating a lot more revenues these days, the bottom line margins, contribution margins of these new SaaS businesses. And I agree. I think there's a fundamental change. No, everyone doesn't want to say this time is different, but I think there's a reason why Snowflake, Datadog, MongoDB, some of these best of breed names are still close to their all-time highs, quite frankly. I think if you notice, those names haven't really budged as much amidst this. And I think the market is, you could say, a lot more smarter about how it prices and growth, especially the future growth rates of these businesses, and I think that's why we're seeing some SaaS stocks are 60%, 40% down, as opposed to some where it looks like institutions just they don't want to sell because they know they're very confident in their growth differential. So that's perfect. I'm just gonna take maybe just two Q&As. I'm so sorry we can't do everyone because we've really gone overboard than we expected. And it's pretty late where Jordan is. But very quickly, I will just is this Stan Pandy 736? Are you still on there? Very quickly, if you want to put your questions really quickly. No? Okay. What about economily? Oh yeah, okay. So I've put you on the speaker phone. Please try saying putting out your question and just one really quick question. No? Are you guys on there still? Okay. We'll just take Mary. Oh, okay. Okay. Looks like most of them are not able to join, so that's perfectly fine. I think this is a good place to just wrap up for today. Um, I think this is a really good place to wrap up. I mean, if you guys have any other questions, I'm very sure Jordan and Simon would be more than happy to take your questions, whether it be over DMs or just send us on the tweet, and we'd be super more than happy to take your questions. But overall, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Jordan, for kind of taking your time. Simon as well for taking your time as well, and just sharing perspectives on set no one. And I think this is the fundamental thing I want everyone to take out of this, quite frankly, today is the fact that um, all of these names are going to do well over the long term, and I don't think we're saying you need to short a particular stock or sell any of these stocks. I think the goal of the spaces was primarily to highlight just key differences and maybe shed more light on specific companies that maybe most people would have neglected on a good day. So thank you so much, Jordan. Maybe you guys just want to let us know where people could find you after this, where they could follow up with you, and kind of the programs that you guys have to offer. Just very quick.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, Francis, firstly, thank you for giving us this chance to share our views. Me and Simon are really appreciative of it, and thank you, Muji, also. Yeah. So we have a subscription service at the marketplace Seeking Alpha called Asymmetric Tech Investments. And we're also replicating that service on Substack also. Um, yeah, I mean, what the service is about. I mean, we're aiming to combine financial analysis with a technologicist mindset, and we're just looking to unveil insights that aren't typically discussed, catalysts that aren't typically being spoken about. Um, and so, yeah, our first mandate of the service is to generate alpha rich insights. Secondarily, our mandate is to knock down the knowledge barriers that investors often face when they're looking to invest in software. So yeah, that's our goal. Insights and aiming to just democratize the knowledge, because we're true believers of, like, if you have a deep understanding, I'm sure, like Francis and Muji, if you have a deep understanding of the technology, then you can avoid getting bogged down in the noise and the differing opinions on a stock that are going to come at you in all directions, and just maintain a long-term focus on the stock and just focus on the most salient points of the investment case. So yeah, that's my part. You can find us a marketplace Seeking Alpha. Simon, I don't know if has Simon got any time to say
Yeah,
anything?
yeah. Just adding to that, I think in the world of investing, so if you are thinking about guys like Warren Buffett, they largely shy away from investing in technology because they think that the tech is harder to understand and there is too much uncertainty associated with the technology. So that also gives a tremendous amount of the room for alpha for those who can understand the technology. And we think that we have a pretty good visibility into some companies that can that have deterministic factors that can define the company in 3 to 5 years going forward. And we are seeing that while the market isn't pricing in the potential of it. So I think that's the place where we can help investors to understand technology with high visibility into the future. And just adding to Jordan, so we also offer free articles on Seeking Alpha and some free article on Substack. So you can follow us here. And also on Twitter, we will just post some little pieces of information from time to time. Yeah, and then overall, thanks you all to join us today, and thanks Fancy for hosting this, and Muji, very insightful. Yeah.
Whoops, looks like we lost Francis, but I'll just add that thanks for the discussion. It's great stuff. Appreciate you sharing your knowledge of these spaces and what these fascinating platforms are doing. Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks for a great discussion, Muji. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Simon. And thank you for everyone listening. And until next time, thank you. Bye.